Today's fifth session on grief and bereavement literacy is titled Grief and Loss During the Holidays. And I just want to introduce what are our presenters. And so we have Pam Bilusack, who is the Executive Director of the BC Bereavement Helpline, who's going to do the educational presentation, and she'll share a little bit of her lived experience. Additionally, we have two others who are here to share their lived experience, Courtney and Fiona. And so today's session will be 15 minutes for the educational presentation by Pam, which is going to be followed by a question and answer period. Then we're going to have 15 minutes of discussion with those who have the lived experience with a question and answer period after. So feel free to sort of write down your questions and we'll save those to the end. And so now it's my pleasure to hand the session over to Pam.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and thank you to BCCPC for putting on this session and bringing us all together as well. So before I tell you a bit more about myself, I'm just going to go over the learning objections for this session. So that would be that you are able to understand and appreciate why grief is amplified during the holidays, come away with some ideas on how to support oneself and/or bereaved communities, and obtain ideas of what a person can do to honor their person. And so I know it can be challenging to talk about this subject matter. Thank you very much for moving that slide along there. And so if you do find that you're experiencing any emotional distress at all or anything, just please take some breaks, take some deep breaths, and just make yourself as comfortable as possible as we work our way through here. And so as Joshua said, I'm the Executive Director for BC Bereavement Helpline. I've been facilitating grief support groups now since before I was the executive director, including holiday-specific grief support groups. I had actually implemented BC Bereavement Helpline's first ever holiday grief support group last December prior to me joining as the executive director. And we have continued that. We actually just had a group for suicide bereaved people last Wednesday. Thank you to the support from BCCPC, we were able to put that on. But aside from my professional experience, I'm joining today as someone who has much lived experience when it comes to grief and loss during the holidays. And so as you'll see, we have a little graphic here of a snowman, and this shows how some people might be feeling during the holiday season. I know I've related to this little melting snowman here. It's the idea of it being the most wonderful time of the year, but is it? If you've experienced loss of any kind and you're going through that grief journey, it likely doesn't feel like the most wonderful time of the year. And so I have experienced many close losses in my life, and I'd actually consider myself a veteran when it comes to dealing with things like firsts, anniversaries, holidays, birthdays. But with each new loss, you get to re-experience all these firsts again. Which is fun, because every grief experience you have is completely different. And so through all of my losses, it was actually the loss of my brother, Brent, that inspired me to get involved with working with people who've been bereaved, and how I gained firsthand knowledge of how people can be impacted during the holidays. We actually lost him to suicide on December 29th, 2007. So right between Christmas and New Year's. We had just enjoyed a lovely Christmas together as a family. We didn't know what a few days later would have in store for us. And where I was supposed to be spending a lovely New Year's Eve celebrating in my mid-20s, instead we were at a funeral home planning my brother's funeral, which was on January 3rd. So that first year after losing him was really a year of shock. But what I did know was life was never going to be the same again. And how do we now deal with all of those firsts, the birthdays, the holidays, things like that came up? And so one thing that I had found worked for myself as well as my mom, we decided that traveling was a way to deal with these things that came up. So his first birthday, when that came around, we went on a cruise. The first Christmas, what we did was we decided we wanted to go somewhere where we were really kind of escaping that whole ambiance that comes around Christmas. So we thought, what is the most like non-Christmassy place? We went to Vegas. which I think in hindsight was, a great option for us. And so, as I said, holidays have never been the same since then. I used to adore our family traditions, and I'll always grieve the loss of those traditions. And so it was really about facing a new reality. I'm originally from Regina, and I ended up leaving Regina after losing my grandma, really because I needed to escape. There was just so much loss that I had dealt with within that city. And, when you're grieving, sometimes you just don't want those reminders around you all the time. And, when it comes to the holidays, that's what we're finding. We can't get away from it. It's always in our face. And so we're really here today to think about maybe not necessarily escaping, but what can we do to help people through the holidays and also honor your person if that's applicable for you. Next slide. So I just want to note that while I will be focusing a little more on grief as it relates to death today, I do want to note that people may be experiencing losses of other types as well. So that could be a relationship, it could be a job, whatever it is, those losses can impact a person differently. And while grief is considered a normal response to loss, it can be really challenging during those particular days, occasions, things like the holidays. At BCBH, we've had feedback from our support groups that actually Halloween was a lot more challenging for people than they had expected. And it seems that, right from Halloween, you go into the holiday season and people are really seeing, things starting to transform. You've got decor, you've got the malls, the stores that are all transforming, and it's literally right in your sight. So after losing someone you care about, you dread those firsts, the first birthday that comes around, a first Mother's Day without a mom, or a mother without a child. And of course, there is the first anniversary of the death, and then the holiday season. And so, as I had mentioned, even with myself, while you go through those firsts, that dread and with those grief experiences, that continues because there's no deadline for grief, as I'm sure many of you know. It just continues. So your feelings can be all over the place. It can be really overwhelming. And there's something called grief bursts. That's something that a person can experience just out of nowhere, where you might experience some sadness, anger, rage, whatever it is. You might be at a shopping mall, a song comes on and it reminds you of your person. I had mentioned this to my colleague Courtney, who will be speaking later. Somehow out of nowhere this week, the song Blue Christmas has been coming up for me, and I've had to change it every single time because it takes me back to the final moments with my grandma, where my sister-in-law had played that so beautifully for my grandma in her final moments. And we're talking 9 years after the loss, but suddenly this year, for some reason, it's bothering me. And so, we can never predict when these are going to come up. It's just really having that awareness that it could happen, and what can I do then when it does happen? And it's really important to then be in those feelings, that those feelings happen. But when it comes to feelings, there are definitely challenges. People might want to isolate more so during the holidays. They might want to be alone. They see other people who are enjoying their family time where they might no longer have a family, or a piece of their family has been removed. In those times, it's really important to have supports around you, and we'll go over that in a little bit as well. Support looks different to everyone, so that will vary. One thing that we do focus on within our support groups at BCBH is really understanding the different grieving styles. So, within a family, if everybody experienced, a relational loss, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to grieve the same. So one person, they might want to express their grief and their loss and, do a tribute to the person. Well, somebody else may not want that. And so it's really important to navigate that and, come to compromise, discuss that, what it looks like for everybody else. And acknowledging that, no two people will grieve the same, and that your feelings just are. And as I had said too, there's that new reality that comes with your loss. There's the old traditions that you would be losing, and those are tied to your secondary losses that you're going to miss some of those things or all of those things because you never have them again. I mentioned mine. Um, when it comes to traditions, it'll vary from person to person, but there's expectations that society and even our own cultural beliefs put on us. And so that might influence what people think is right and, how they should be dealing with the holiday season, what they should be doing. And those expectations just then add to the stress that a person is already experiencing when they're going through their grief. So then that leads me to when people are forced with making decisions, what might normally seem like a small decision that a person would have to make. When you're grieving in general, but of course during the holidays, it seems that there are so many decisions to make. Where do we go? What do we do? Maybe you don't even want to celebrate this year. You want to skip right over the holiday season. It can really be overwhelming. So making those decisions and sitting with them is part of the journey as well. Next slide. And so, well, a person might not feel that they're in a place to experience joy in the holiday season. It's important to note some ways that a person can really help themselves through not only the holiday season, but different dates and occasions that come up. As I had mentioned last year before I was the executive director, we had a BC support group for people who've experienced suicide loss. And that was really inspired by people from our 8-week group who had said, we were ending the first week of December, and they said, now what? Now what am I going to do? We're heading into the holiday season. We had support up until now, and now we don't have support. It just felt like it was being cut off for them. And as you see those needs, it's like, how can we help more people? And I would say like almost every participant said how the holiday season in particular was going to be more challenging for them, whether it was the first holiday season, the second, or the third. And then last week, we just hosted another session where we had very, very fresh losses. I'm talking a matter of weeks to, over 10 years. And so it just shows too that, it doesn't matter where you are on the grief spectrum, it's still going to continue through the holiday season and in your life as a whole. So as there's no way to get over grief, there's no way to get over or past the holidays. You can do what you can to get through it. And that's where, we're just going to look at some ideas that some tips. A lot of these have been compiled by our participants through the support groups. We listen to what they're saying and what has worked for them, and then we compile these lists. And one of the ones that really stands out the most is just saying tentative. So going back to the decision making, you might not have to say yes or no all the time. Say tentative. I might be there, I might not be there. Then you're releasing those expectations from yourself as well, which that is also then tied into the boundaries. So setting those boundaries, whether that is with work, with friends, your own self-care, whatever that might look like, know what is comfortable for you. And then with the self-care, there's the different aspects, whether it's emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally, and socially. Acknowledging all those different areas and how you can engage to help yourself through the season. It might be something as simple as having a shower, journaling, whatever that might be. And then when you're getting through the holidays, a lot of the times when you're grieving, you are forced to deal with the fact of the traditions. Do you hold on to the traditions that you already had, or do you create new? And so that's where you have to have a conversation with yourself and whomever you're involved with to determine what is right for you. You might want to do something like order food in, as that will release some of your pressure if you're normally the one responsible for cooking the meals. And decorating, that can also seem like a big burden where maybe you loved to before. And part of you might want to, but you don't want to see it in your house because every decoration you pull out reminds you of somebody. And so one way around that people have found works for them is going to their friends and helping them, because they still get that joy of, putting something up, but it might not be right in their face then at home. Another thing that has come up throughout these discussions is really unplugging. Of course, there's TV, it's in your face for sure. I think every other commercial right now is holiday related, and or every channel has a holiday specific movie on. But then social media, as we know, people always like to share the best of themselves. And so you see all the happy times and the good times, and that can really encourage your feelings of loneliness when you're seeing that, and even feelings of anger and guilt, whatever it might be. So, you might want to remove some apps during that time. And just, I think I said this before, but really taking your feelings as they are. If you're feeling down today and you want to stay in that, the feelings of crying, whatever it is, embrace that as part of your grief. And another thing that I know I have found beneficial, as I mentioned, and others, it seems that a vast majority of people in our group seem to do the whole escaping, the traveling. It seems to be one way that works for people. It might not be year after year, but maybe it's, the first year, whatever works. Actually, this year, we had lost a very close family friend, lost their son who I went to school with back in Regina. And being somebody who's experienced grief, I recognize that this could be really challenging. This was just a matter of months ago that he died. And so I invited her to come out here because I saw that, it could be really challenging. And she's coming here on December 25th. So next, please. And so being aware of possible activities, places, people that might impact your feelings negatively. We all know those family members or friends who can, it's that one thing they say, or they look at your grief and they make assumptions, whatever it is. You might need to skip out on some of those family dinners if you know that that's going to be challenging for you. On the other side of that, really embrace those moments where there might be fun, laughter, and try to stay away from those feelings of guilt when those moments come, because they could be rare. And tied to that, there's the idea of giving back, volunteering. You might want to cook a meal that your loved one or your person really appreciated and then donate it. And again, as we had talked about with isolation, it might be right at certain times for a person, but we do recommend you challenge that as much as possible. Even if that means making baby steps and going out for half an hour if you can, just challenge that. And then having a support place and a support system that looks different for everybody as well. BCBH does have a helpline that's available throughout the holiday season. And so if nothing else, we do encourage people to reach out in places like that. Next screen. Thank you. And so depending where a person is in their grief and how long it's been since their loss, they may or may not want to consider ways to honor their person. But again, this is something that we've come up with people from our support groups. When it does feel right to them, for them to honor their person, whether it's during the holiday season, a birthday, whatever it might be. These are some ideas that we have come up with. And the main one that we really focus on at BCBH is continuing bonds. So that's, reliving and living with that person, even though they're not physically here. And this came up in our meeting last Wednesday, something as simple as saying hello to them. You might want to write them a letter, create a scrapbook, photo book, and just reconnect with their life. It could be something as simple as a candle. Just place a candle, that's there to honor them. Having a spot at the table, whether or not you want to put a meal on, however you want to handle that. And take turns sharing memories. A memory jar is something fun for people to do. If you've got a family or a friend group where everybody participates, puts a memory in, and then you read them all out loud. And you can really learn some interesting things about a person that you've lost through that. And you could create a game or trivia. And then if applicable, you might want to go to the memorial site. And we will move on to the next slide. I'm cognizant of the time here, so I'm going to try whipping through here. All right, so we have a few more examples here that would include creating or buying a decoration, watching their favorite movie. And I'll never forget that we had one support group participant that said, like, it doesn't have to be a holiday movie. Maybe it's their, Friday the 13th. Do complete opposite, whatever it is that works for you. Turning their clothing, blanket, whatever it is, into something you can remember them by, whether it's a pillow, a teddy bear, and just playing their favorite song or music if that's something that comforts you. And so now I'm just going to loop back to supports during the holiday season. I had mentioned that BCBH has a helpline. And so I'm going to give some more information on that before we close here. Our helpline, it's generally open Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then Wednesdays, 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., Saturday, 9 to 1. You do see our holiday hours here as well. What's really important for this is if you are somebody experiencing grief, loss of any kind, we have compassionate volunteers on the other end who are there to listen to you. If you feel like there's nobody else to talk to, feel free to pick up the line and call us. And then we do have our traumatic loss support groups as well. Definitely you can find more information on all of this on our website. But one thing I wanted to give more detail on is the traumatic loss facilitator training. That's where a lot of grief professionals, so hospices, there's probably many of you who've taken it in the past, but that's where we give the education to provide an overview of how a person can implement the 8-week groups. And whether that be for traumatic loss or just general grief. We do have 2 sessions coming up next year, one in January, one in February, and that information is on our website as well. And now the next slide, I just wanted to do something that we normally do in our groups, is close off with a poem. I know we've got to get into the other portion of the presentation here, but I just wanted to close off with this. This is called Just Like Grief by Angela Miller. There are no rules for surviving holiday grief. Do what you need to do to survive. Honor your loved one how you need to, and do what feels best for your fragile, aching heart. You are missing a huge piece of you, so do whatever you need to do to find a sliver of peace. And that is the presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, for that presentation and providing some wisdom from what you're seeing through your own people who are coming to you and the people that you're supporting. So I'd like to now open it up for questions or comments from those who are in the audience. So feel free to raise your Zoom hand or put a question in the chat. We'll just have time for a few. And as we are hosting this as a meeting and not a webinar session, on your PC there is a button in the top corner screen where you can change it to highlight the speaker, and we ask that you do that now. And so there has been a couple questions about in the chat. Is the BC Bereavement Helpline available to people outside BC?
Yes. Yes, anybody across Canada can call.
Do you get many people from across Canada that know about the number?
We do. We even have people outside of Canada call, outside of North America call. And then those ones, it's always like, how did you reach us? How did you find our number? Because usually that's due to Google, they'll Google bereavement support, helpline, whatever it might be. And then we come up. So, and I do acknowledge, I'm sorry, I had our number incorrect on the PowerPoint, but Courtney, thank you for correcting that in the chat.
That's great. So is there any more questions or comments? I'm just for the people who are listening, I'm really curious about which holidays that they find most difficult for them personally. So if they want to put that in the chat also, it'd be interesting to see what comes up. I know for me personally, I lost my father, and so Father's Day has always been one of the more significant holidays that I have to acknowledge, or it can come out sideways is the best way to put it. And so like I learned to acknowledge and reflect that, and as you sort of said, I do something to remember him on that day, like eating one of his favorite foods, which is chicken wings. So I thought that was like nice that you mentioned the food part. Yeah, and then if there's no Thanksgiving,
Thank you, Willa. Mm.
Mm.
Oh, I'm so sorry, both of you, for your losses. Wow.
And you did mention the first are usually really challenging, but what do you think about the seconds, the thirds, the fourth, the tenths, and how friends and family can support those people? Because I think most attention for people is on the firsts.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a very good point. And especially depending what type of loss, as I said, with the traumatic loss for myself, the first year we were literally in shock. And so the second year was actually the most challenging for us. But for in general, as there is no timeline for grief, it's the same that continues. So a person might be able to have those celebrations and those traditions this year, but really understand and appreciate that next year it might not be the same for them. They might not want to celebrate, because grief is not linear. Those feelings change. There could be something else that comes up. You might see other people who are starting to have babies that could influence, the way that you're feeling, whatever it is. Just be there to support them and meet them where they're at.
okay, that's great. And let's see if there's any more questions. If not, we will. I think Courtney answered that last question on who is.
She's great on the chat.
Oh, she's doing really well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any advice or tips that you'd give to someone who is supporting someone who is grieving?
Yeah, so I think that's where, really acknowledging different grief styles is important. Appreciate what type of griever they are. If they do want to hold it in, don't push them, whatever it might be. But then offer your support however you can. Maybe they aren't able to cook, but they want to enjoy a meal. Offer to make a meal. Again, meet them where they're at. See what will work for them, and take that as your guide. Some you might want to use some of these ideas though to present to them, because sometimes you might be in that grief fog. That's why this list has become so robust, because people are coming up with some of these ideas. So you might want to present some of these ideas to them, as ways that they might want to honor their loved one, or ways that they might want to look at, working their way through the holiday season or any occasion.
And then there's a question on where can they find a copy of the poem. I believe we're going to be sending at be in the session notes. And then the last one we have before we move on is one person always looks for good holiday activities for children and youth. Do you know of any?
Yeah, not specific, but Dallas, yeah, we should definitely connect on that. She's the expert. We'll have to work with her on that. Yeah, self-admittedly, we are not experts when it comes to, dealing with that with children. Activity-based things though, for sure. It's really about getting their minds and hands busy. I do know that much.
Okay, thank you, Pam, so much for taking the time to present and share some of your wisdom and also your personal experience. And we'll come back to you, I guess, next when we talk to everyone about the lived experience. So we also have Courtney and Fiona here also with us today, who are here to share their lived experience. And so I would like to start by asking each of you about your loss story and the impact that the different holidays have had on your grief journey. And so, Courtney, if you can begin, and then Pam can take over the question box.
For sure. Sorry, I'll stop. I'm actually not here on a BCBH capacity. I'm here to share my personal story. So I lost my dad on Thanksgiving Day, 2021. He had his first and only heart attack. So it was really unexpected. He was only 54 years old. So as you know, Thanksgiving is right before Christmas. So it was a tough time. Our first year, of course, Thanksgiving was a moot point at that point, and we had a lot of other things to deal with. But the first Christmas, my mom really wanted to find a way to bring him into our celebrations. So she created a trivia game, a dad-based trivia game. So she asked us different questions about his life, and we didn't keep score, but I did win, and we got to learn a lot about our dad that we didn't know before, or things that, you don't typically tell your kids, maybe. Um, it was a really fun way to have him there. And I actually flew down. I didn't used to live in Vancouver. I flew down to be with my family for the first time in like 6 years to be with them for Christmas. So that was one way that I dealt with it, was just being near them. And then 2 days after Christmas is actually my birthday. And the year that he died was my 30th, which typically is a milestone or whatever. But I chose to ignore it that year. And instead, the word birthday was not mentioned in the apartment. And I snuggled with my dog and watched horror movies all day, because those are things that bring me comfort. Um, and interestingly, New Year's, actually, the first New Year's hit me harder than expected, because the next day was the start of a full year without him. And to me, that was something that was really hard to grapple with, that I really didn't expect, to be honest. I knew Christmas, I knew my birthday would be hard, but New Year's I'd never really cared about. But that was a big thing for me. Um, Yeah, and then so I actually really love the question about the seconds, because the first, I find you do have a lot of support. People know it's your first Father's Day without your father thinking of you. But those days still are hard, the seconds, the thirds, etc. And for us, we really found a way to reframe holidays to what was important. And for us, that's just spending time together. So Thanksgiving, we do typically do whatever everyone feels they need. Like last year, I needed to not have it be a thing. So I just spent the day with my dad. I watched Star Wars because that was our thing. I wrote to him. I wore his jacket, and I just like spent that day being with him. And then Christmas, instead of having, one or two people cooking this big dinner, we did like a food share style. So everyone brought a little something, and then we just got to spend time together instead of isolating two people making turkey or whatever. Um, yeah, and then I do want to talk about like new roles and secondary losses, but I don't know what the upcoming questions are, so I can hold off on that if you want.
I think it's good for you to talk about it now if it's on your heart.
Okay, okay. Um, yeah, so just one thing that I would encourage people to think about is those little ways that your person was involved in the holidays. For example, my dad was a huge birthday dude. He texts you the day before, happy day before your birthday. It texts you as soon as your birthday. It texts you the day after your birthday, happy day after your birthday. And all of a sudden, that was missing. And that was, again, something that caught me off guard, because, you get it and you're like, haha, thanks, dad. Like, oh, okay. And then you don't get it. And that was something we talked about. So my mom actually has started doing that, because she took some time and then she's like, I got to take this over because it's part of his legacy. And then another little thing was, dad always played Santa at Christmas morning. Someone has to hand out the presents. And he was always that guy. So that was another thing. It was literally Christmas morning. And my brother I have two nieces. And so Christmas morning, we sit down to have Christmas, and we're like, oh, someone has to grab these, I guess. And so we gave it off to the 9-year-old, and she loves doing it. And then another little thing is my dad made the best stuffing, and having those little things missing that you don't think about. So I just encourage you to take the time to think about those things and have a moment to grieve them for yourself, because they can catch you off guard. And these are just the ways that the losses that we feel really impact us ongoing. It's been hard.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney, for sharing. But yeah, the secondary losses and all the different transitions that you have to make, and the shock of what those feelings are at those moments. Like you can't really prepare for it because it just comes, and then you have to sort of work with it. I'm really curious if you had. I know you said your dog was one of the supports. I'm really interested in knowing. Um, did you have to tell your friends and family how you're feeling, or did they offer that willingly and ask you what you needed?
I'm gonna be honest and say no. They didn't. They didn't ask. And after the first couple months, because most of my friends, being the age we are, haven't lost their parents. And so they didn't know how to deal with it either. And I have had conversations subsequently about it and let them know, like, hey, this is actually really tough. And I felt unsupported, and this is what I need. I am really bad at isolating, like Pam said, a lot of people are when it comes to grief. And so it was really a challenge for me to tell them what I need. And sometimes that is talking about it, sometimes it is ignoring it and spending time alone. Um, and it wasn't after work until I started working for BCBH, which was about 9 months after I lost my dad, that I really understood what I was going through and how to communicate it. And I recognize not everyone can do that. So I think it just takes a lot of internal searching of what you need and recognizing that that can change moment to moment, and just being comfortable enough to tell people what you need. Again, this year we're skipping my birthday and we're going away for a couple days because I just cannot be bothered. And also, with Pam's note, I'm a big fan of deactivating Facebook as much as possible. Um, so if that's an option for you, that's a great thing to do.
Okay, thank you for providing some of that information just about how you work through it and the courage it takes sometimes, even while you're bereaved, to also ask for support and being vulnerable and saying what you need and what you don't need in certain times. And so we'll leave some of the questions till after we talk to Fiona. So Fiona,
Yes,
I know you wanted to share a poem. Not sure if you want to do that now or later. And also just tell us about your lost story and the impact of the holidays on your grief.
sure. I lost my dad when I was 11 years old. I was the eldest and still am the eldest of three children. And my mom and dad had had a pretty fraught relationship too. Um, for a variety of reasons. They're both physicians, and I'm just going to unplug that. They're both physicians, and my mother wasn't allowed to work, so she was very unhappy in the household. So my dad was diagnosed with liver cancer, and he died within 3 months. And we kids were not prepared for that. So he was in the hospital for a while. He came home for Christmas, and then a few days later, he was in a coma, and then he passed. So it was a total shock to us kids, probably not to my mother or other adult relatives, but it was a total shock. And we were in a state of disbelief, or at least I was, for a long time. It just didn't feel real. And there wasn't any talk of feelings. We were not an affectionate, huggy, kissy family at all. I didn't know my dad very well because he was in charge of the world outside of the home and working. And I was just really confused about why people were grieving, because my mother was always fighting with my dad. So why was she so sad? And what were people expecting from me? They seemed to be expecting certain kinds of behavior from me that I didn't understand. I'd never experienced a death before, and nobody was telling me what I was supposed to do. So we went to the funeral, and that was really, really difficult. It was totally surreal. For one thing, they were speaking in Cantonese, which I hardly understood, barely understood beyond, baby words and dim sum words. So whatever religious stuff they were saying was just over my head. And we were kept as kids way in the back, so I couldn't see above all the adult heads. And then there was the burial, and of course, I didn't see the body, my dad's body. So it was such a weird, surreal, unpleasant, scary experience. And I wasn't responding in the way that my grandparents and my mother expected. I wasn't weeping. I was just kind of in this frozen state, going through the motions, wear black. Okay, I'll put on black, make sure that you say hello to this relative and shake their hand and so forth. And I remember all these relatives coming by and saying they were sorry. And I just was not taking it in. And I was experiencing disapproval, anger, and judgment from my grandparents. And my mother was too out of it to say anything, but from my grandparents and other relatives who were expecting me to behave a certain way. So I knew there was these expectations, but I wasn't going to pretend. So every Christmas, which I didn't know that was my dad's last Christmas at the house when he came in an ambulance and a wheelchair and everything. So I felt very bad about not knowing that and not having spent more time with him, because I was dealing with a regular Christmas, although I knew something was weird that no one was telling me about. But every Christmas after that was just this horrible Christmas where my mom would go through the motions, and then she'd go to her room and she'd have the lights turned off and she'd cry. And then the three of us would sit there and have this terrible Christmas with presents that we didn't necessarily want. And we weren't going to generate a happy spirit by ourselves. So it wasn't until many years later that we sort of built up some other Christmas traditions for us to understand more about our dad and find out more about him. But it wasn't going to be through our mom, because she was so upset. We had to find out through other relatives. But we would go every Father's Day and every Christmas to the cemetery. So I wrote a poem, which I'll quickly read, that was published in my first book. I'm Vancouver's Poet Laureate. I'm supposed to be spreading the good word of poetry to everybody. I'm sure all of you know all about poetry, but I'll share this poem. And I found that writing these poems about my grief were actually very cathartic. So I recommend poetry to everyone, whether it's a poem in the form of an actual poem, or it's a form of a drawing, or some other kind of ritual. But here's this poem about going on Father's Day and how unpleasant it was for us. Father's Day. We head out once or twice a year with durable bouquets to where the dead have been parked under nameplates, sometimes by a hedge or a tree. Your father can't see you, how you've all grown up. We can't see him either. The sky is not heaven, this earth no window. I don't want her memories of clanging pots shouting at a man who looked away. I've made my own archive, a few pale frames of a silent man I wasn't allowed to know. A few more cars stop nearby, spilling sparse corteges. Mourners stand like us, limp-armed, waiting beside gravestones for a meaning that nudges our corners, but never comes in. So we went through this ritual, which didn't really have meaning for me until many, many, many years later. I went on to, finished high school, went to university, and I was in law school. And I was going through a lot of stress with law school, as a lot of law students do. And I went to see a counselor. And for some reason, we didn't end up talking about law school. We talked about my father's death. And it all came out. And suddenly, because I hadn't been able to cry about my dad's death until he died when I was 11. So I was in my mid-20s. That's how long it took. And so I did. And we ended up talking not about law school ever. We talked about my dad. And that opened the door. And then after law school and my deciding not to become a lawyer, I decided to write. And I wrote a lot of poems about my dad and what I didn't know, because you can write about absence as well as presence, and studied creative writing and published some poems, and eventually created some of my own rituals, meaningful rituals about how to cope with my dad's death. And if I might, I'll just read this sort of follow-up poem where I kind of come full circle. And it's from a more recent book, Offering. Kneeling by his grave, I offer my father a cup of tea, the way he'd wanted it before he died. I was 11 when the rented wheelchair came. I plowed long furrows into the carpets. He was home after months in hospital. Ringed by family, he asked for lemon tea, a bit of sugar, not too hot. Assigned the task, I went to the kitchen, filled a mug with lukewarm water, squeezed a tea bag against the side to tint the water, a splash of lemon from an ancient bottle, sugar, not enough. A precarious march back to his bedside. He sipped it and winced. Good, he said, though it wasn't. Fell back to the pillow. Christmas Eve, he was wheeled out for company. My mother, a red-eyed bullet through the thrumming house. Amid the clink of teacups, he lay on the couch, filmed with sweat from the toll of being alive. Quiet and cool in my room, I sat alone with a box of Swiss chocolate, miniatures in neat white cubicles, the waxy sweetness of the milk and white bars of prim smothering. The nuts were grit on my teeth and tongue, only the bitter one tasted of something I could have felt. But today, at last, I've done it right. A good pour of amber honey, fresh lemon, boiling water, loose leaves. Tea brewed hot and strong. Drink, my father, as I drink to you, the striving of sun, sky, earth, and flesh held within these porcelain cups. So just like Pam and Courtney were saying, is those rituals. You can make your own ritual. You can adapt your own ritual and make meaning. And find your own way through grief. And that's basically what I had to do.
Well, thank you, Fiona, so much for sharing and the process. You said like when our losses are and how we're able to cope, it can be a long time before we actually get to feel some of those feelings just because of who's around and what we know about grief. And so I think it's a great understanding of that. It's sometimes not that first year, it's that 10th year or 20th year that opens up those rituals and opens up those emotions, and that's okay. And that's normal. So thank you so much for sharing. And so we're going to take questions. So if anyone has any questions about anything that was heard, about their own lived experience, that they want to share to Fiona, Courtney, or Pam, and this is a great moment to be able to do that. A lot of people are thanking you guys for your sharing. And we'll see if anything comes in, but I do have a question, is that um, what lessons, what's a lesson learned from going through the journey that you'd like to share with people?
I would say just to release any expectations. Uh, whether it's the first year, the fifth year. I mean, we're heading into the 16th year with my brother, and the every year can be so different. So don't have any expectations that things will start to become your new normal. Whatever it might be. Expectations of family and friends, it seems it's natural to maybe expect that they'll acknowledge certain days because maybe you do. Um, but because we all grieve so differently, we can't necessarily count on others for that or their support, whichever way it goes. So releasing expectations would be my biggest outcome.
I would just say, as someone that really likes to compartmentalize and put things aside, like grief, if you do that and that's how you need to get through the first little bit, just remember to take it out again in whatever way that might be for you. Art therapy, writing, maybe it's meditation where you're reflecting, or just working with a counselor, which I recommend anyways, but just remembering to take it out again so you're not prolonging the initial grief too much, and you can start integrating it.
Okay, and Fiona, any last words from you?
Um, just that you will get through the holidays, and the wonderful tips from Pam and Courtney and that have been discussed today, I think were wonderful. I wish I'd had these when I was a younger person. but I want to share them with friends and family who are going through grief right now.
If I can just echo what Fiona said there, I would agree. You know, that's one thing I mentioned in our suicide grief support groups. I wish I had that education offered to me after the loss. And so often it's these things that we learn after. And so any grief professionals who are in this room, you know, this is why we are here, to try to help everybody else out there who isn't aware of the supports and the resources available to them, and even just the tips, you know, normalizing grief, really normalizing it so people don't feel so alone. I
We
see a
have a,
hand up.
yes, we have a question.
Hello, thank you. This has been a wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question. Um, it's great that you acknowledge that you have all these traditions and do what feels right and go on vacation or cook a meal. But when you have people in a home, particularly youth, teenagers, and they don't like talking about death, and they just don't want, you know, me to be sad, or because we've had couple of losses in our family, a suicide this year and a brother who's ill, and mine, and they want to put it on a shelf because it's Christmas, right? So, any suggestions of, and I've gotten this from clients too. I'm a nurse, and how do you navigate that piece, right, where they're not comfortable with changing up the traditions because they want everything to be fine and open up the presents, and like, you know, that trivia game, I wanted to do that for my brother and they thought that'll be super weird, mom, you know. So any thoughts or insight into that piece?
If I may say, the first part would be, there's the analogy of, you know, on the airline, you put on the mask if it's going down, to take care of yourself first. That's what's most important, to, you know, take care of yourself first. And, you know, when there's a group of people, it's almost impossible that everybody's going to agree on what is right. So trying to find that compromise, you know, and so listening to everybody's perspective. And while you might want to do the trivia, maybe there's something at a smaller scale you can introduce first and see what would work. And sometimes, you know, it may not work for everybody. And so maybe there's a way that you individually can honor your loved ones or person in your own way as well.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
And we have one question. Any tips for knowing this is a loved one's last Christmas?
Yeah, that's a tough one for sure. Again, you know, it boils down to do what feels right for you, and just making sure that, you know, you try to limit any of those feelings of guilt you might experience by not doing something. So whether that be that you want to share something verbally with them or write something for them, you know, it's tough. That is definitely tough. I have been there as well. Um, there's no right or wrong way, but do what works for you to help yourself through that, while also supporting them. You know, be there for them in whatever way you can.
Okay, thank you to everyone that was able to share and present today and open their hearts. Really appreciate you just coming on and presenting and sharing your story. We know a lot of people have been moved by what you've said, and we can get a lot of wisdom from what people have done in their journeys to help us make it easier as we walk ours. So just thank you again. So we hope that everyone enjoyed the session, and we will be asking you to complete a short survey, and the link's going to be in the chat if you have the opportunity. So the registration for the next session in the series, titled Peer Support and Validation for MAID-Specific Loss, is scheduled for Thursday, January 25th at 12 p.m. Pacific time, and so we'll have a link in the chat for that also. And so to be notified of other sessions in the series, you can subscribe to our newsletter at the BC Center for Palliative Care. And our aim is to provide a copy of this presentation recording and also summary notes to you in the next 7 business days. So watch your email for this information or visit the center's website for any kind of upcoming ECHO sessions. So thank you again for attending. Really appreciate you being here and wanting to learn more about grief and bereavement.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.